The life of a medieval sailor was, at first glance, an existence defined by monotony, yet within that monotony was a fragile framework of survival and discipline that allowed men to endure the harshest conditions on earth, or at least on water. Before a sailor even set foot on a vessel, much of his life was dictated by the mundane necessities of preparation, physical readiness, social obligations, and the laborious process of provisioning. You might imagine the romanticized image of a sailor, a heroic figure braving the waves, but the reality was far less glamorous. In truth, the medieval sailor's daily life began not at sea, but in the harbor towns, where weeks or even months were spent waiting for ships, negotiating wages, and gathering supplies. Most sailors were peasants, laborers, or craftsmen who took to the sea seasonally. Life on land was rarely luxurious. Their diets were simple and repetitive: rye bread, salted pork, cheese, and whatever vegetables could be grown locally. For those intending to sail, dietary preparation was essential. A sailor's body needed reserves of fat and strength to endure the rigors of the voyage. Those who could afford it might stockpile dried fruits, nuts, and occasionally salted fish. Wealthier merchants or captains could add imported goods like olive oil or wine, but for the average sailor, monotony was unavoidable. You ate, you slept, you worked, and you hoped to survive the unpredictable whims of weather and fortune. Provisioning was a logistical nightmare. Ships of the era could not carry fresh food for long journeys, so preservation was key. Salted meat and fish were staples. They were cheap, durable, and reasonably nutritious. Grain in the form of hardtack, an unyielding biscuit made from flour and water, provided calories but little pleasure. Sailors chewed these dry bricks while working, often accompanying them with a mouthful of beer or small wine rations, which doubled as a minor antiseptic. Water, surprisingly, was often in shorter supply than alcohol, as barrels of water were prone to souring. The careful rationing of both food and drink became an early lesson in patience and resourcefulness, skills that would be tested hundreds of miles from shore. Beyond physical preparation, the social structure of a shipyard played a subtle yet important role. Sailors were bound by hierarchy long before leaving port. The captain was the ultimate authority, followed by the boatswain, the cook, and other petty officers who maintained order. Discipline was strict, though enforcement varied widely. Some captains preferred harsh punishment, whippings, extra labor, or confinement in the ship's hold, while others relied on experience and mutual respect to keep the crew aligned. The negotiation of wages was also a source of tension, as payment was rarely upfront. Sailors often accepted shares of profit or payment contingent on the successful completion of the voyage. This uncertainty weighed heavily on the psyche, as it meant months of danger and discomfort could end in financial disappointment, or worse, death. Once aboard, a sailor's first days involved acclimatization and endless chores. Ropes, sails, and the wooden hull itself demanded constant attention. The texture of rope fibers, the smell of pitch, and the friction of sails whipping in wind were constant companions. Every day, crews climbed rigging, scrubbed decks, and repaired minor damages before they became catastrophic. Life at sea was rhythmically boring, punctuated by sudden bouts of terror when storms approached. Sailors quickly learned that the quiet days, often spent mending nets or observing the endless expanse of water, were the moments that tested endurance the most. Boredom at sea was insidious, leading to fatigue and mental weariness that could become as dangerous as any storm. Sleep was erratic and fitful. Hammocks were uncommon. Most sailors slept on deck or in the cramped, poorly ventilated space below. The smell of tar, salt, and sweat permeated every sleeping quarter. Even in these uncomfortable conditions, sailors were expected to maintain watches. Keeping vigil for hazards, other ships, or sudden weather changes meant rotating shifts, sometimes only a few hours of rest at a time. Those unaccustomed to this schedule often succumbed to exhaustion quickly, further increasing the risk of accidents. The monotony extended to the very motions of sailing. Day after day, sailors performed repetitive tasks, hauling ropes, adjusting sails, swabbing decks, and tending to the rigging. The physical effort was constant, and the repetitive labor could dull the senses. Yet within these repetitive motions, there was a rhythm that allowed sailors to survive. Each knot tied, each sail adjusted, each barrel swabbed contributed to the ship's overall stability and, in turn, to the survival of everyone on board. This mechanical repetition became a form of meditation, a mental technique to withstand the endless expanse of water. Hygiene was another ongoing concern. Bathing was rare, and the opportunity to wash clothes or oneself was limited by both time and resources. The unwashed smells of sweat, tar, and sea permeated clothing and hair. Rats and lice were constant nuisances, and the close quarters made disease a silent, ever-present threat. Scurvy, the deficiency of vitamin C, could develop subtly at first, manifesting as gum swelling, fatigue, and irritability, before eventually crippling the sailor if left unchecked. Few knew the cause or cure in the medieval period, making prevention a matter of luck, access to fresh produce, or knowledge passed down by tradition, rather than science. The quietest moments were often the most revealing. When the sun set and the ship drifted in the calm of the open sea, sailors sometimes sat in silence, listening to the creaking of the timbers, the lapping of waves, and the distant cries of seabirds. These moments, though uneventful in the conventional sense, revealed the precarious balance of survival. A single misstep in navigation, a single misjudged rope, could result in catastrophe. Sailors, therefore, lived in a paradoxical state of boredom and heightened awareness. Every small action mattered, even when the day seemed endlessly mundane. In these early days before departure, sailors formed a cautious camaraderie. Shared meals, shared stories, and shared anxieties created bonds that could determine survival later. Trust in one's fellow crew members was not optional. It was essential. Yet, social hierarchies and rivalries also simmered beneath the surface. Even the smallest disagreements could escalate in the confined environment of a ship, foreshadowing the tensions that storms and long voyages would amplify. As departure approached, a final set of preparations loomed. Cargo needed securing, rigging double-checked, and the stores of salted meat and hardtack meticulously counted. Captains held brief meetings to outline routes, expected weather patterns, and contingency plans for emergencies. Even then, these plans were subject to the whims of wind and current, factors no human could control. Sailors understood, on an instinctual level, that once they left port, their lives would be governed as much by luck as by skill. And yet, amidst all this monotony and preparation, there was a sense of anticipation. The open sea offered not only danger, but possibility. The chance to earn pay, to travel beyond the confines of village life, or simply to test one's resilience. But as sailors gazed at the horizon and felt the tension in the ropes beneath their hands, one question lingered more than any other. How would they endure the unpredictable, often deadly, days ahead? When the day finally came for the ship to leave port, the sailors felt the familiar mix of anticipation and unease that had shadowed them for weeks. The vessel, usually a modest merchant ship or small cog, bobbed gently against the quay, its hull creaking under the weight of cargo and provisions. Sailors clambered over ropes, tested sails, and inspected timbers one last time. The ship smelled of pitch, wet wood, and the lingering tang of salt, a scent they would come to associate with their lives afloat. The departure itself was an orchestrated, almost ceremonial, routine. Lines were thrown to the dockhands, sails adjusted to catch the first favorable wind, and a small bell or shouted signal marked the official start of the voyage. Townspeople watched, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of concern. Families waved, vendors called, and sometimes local clergy blessed the ship and its crew with a sprinkling of holy water. Sailors, though preoccupied with duties, could not help but notice the finality of leaving familiar land behind. Once beyond the safety of the harbour, there would be no turning back until weeks or months later. The first days at sea were deceptively calm. The ship cut through gentle waves, and the monotony of work that had begun in port continued on deck. Sailors hoisted sails, swabbed the deck, and tended the rigging, all under the guidance of the boatswain, whose voice barked orders over the wind. The first lesson became immediately apparent. The sea is slow to teach, but unforgiving when it does. Even calm waters required constant attention. A loose rope or mismanaged sail could result in damage to the ship or injury to a sailor. For the inexperienced, each motion felt laborious, each day interminable. Meals remained rudimentary. Hardtack and salted meat formed the core diet, with small allowances for beer or wine. Fresh water was carefully rationed, often measured in wooden ladles. The sailors' digestion suffered, though it was rarely discussed openly. Men developed an uneasy camaraderie around the table or on deck, since space below was too cramped for group meals. They chewed mechanically, swallowed sparingly, and waited for the next task. Yet even these dull routines were punctuated by moments of subtle danger. The slightest misstep on a wet deck could send a man sprawling, or worse, overboard. Life at sea demanded adaptation to the elements, which were unpredictable even in the best seasons. Winds might vanish entirely, leaving the ship drifting aimlessly. Storms could appear suddenly, sweeping across the horizon and darkening the sky in minutes. Sailors learned to read subtle signs, the color and texture of clouds, the behavior of seabirds, and the smell of the air. Ancient lore, observation, passed from captain to crew over decades, guided decisions that today we would call meteorology. A change in wind direction, the swell of a distant wave, or the sudden calm before a storm could dictate hours or even days of labor and anxiety. Storms, when they came, were the truest test of skill and endurance. A sudden squall could whip the sea into frothing chaos. Waves crashed against the hull, flooding the deck, twisting ropes, and snapping masts. Sailors scrambled to secure sails and cargo, shouting warnings over the roar of the wind. Every knot tied, every rope hauled, became a matter of survival. In these moments, the repetitive labor that had once seemed dull transformed into life-saving necessity. Even the most experienced sailors could not anticipate every hazard. The sea was both teacher and executioner. Navigation presented another layer of complexity. Without a compass or detailed charts, sailors relied on dead reckoning, celestial observation, and intuition. By day, the sun's position helped determine latitude, while at night, stars offered guidance across unfamiliar waters. Sailors memorized constellations, noting shifts in tides and currents. These methods were prone to error, of course, and a single miscalculation could result in days of drift or a perilous approach to rocky shores. The monotony of checking instruments, adjusting course, and recording observations was punctuated by the ever-present risk of running aground or colliding with hidden shoals. Disease and hygiene continued to threaten life at sea. Close quarters, damp conditions, and limited food variety bred sickness. Scurvy claimed strength slowly, first dulling the spirit, then crippling the body. Dysentery could erupt suddenly, incapacitating multiple crew members at once. Sailors understood the importance of diet, cleanliness, and ventilation, though remedies were rudimentary. Citrus fruits were sometimes available, either carried for luck or purchased at port, but often they were too scarce or too expensive to make a difference. Instead, crews relied on crude treatments, folklore, and hope. Even minor injuries, cuts from rope burns or splintered wood, could become infected, slowing labor and increasing tension among the already fatigued sailors. Daily routine, however, was punctuated by fleeting moments of fascination. The endless horizon could mesmerize. The patterns of waves, hypnotic. Some sailors kept rudimentary logs, noting watercolor, wind speed, or passing birds. Others observed marine life, fish, seals, or the occasional whale, often with curiosity rather than fear. Even the small rituals of work, coiling rope, swabbing the deck, adjusting sails, offered a sense of order amid chaos. These small certainties were what kept sailors anchored psychologically as much as physically. Social dynamics played a subtle, but vital, role in survival. Crew members, though bound by hierarchy, developed informal systems of trust and cooperation. Skills were shared. An inexperienced sailor might learn to tie a complex knot from an older hand, or anticipate a change in wind pattern by watching the reactions of the more seasoned crew. Conflicts arose, naturally, but the shared risk of death or injury imposed a restraint that might otherwise have been absent. Leadership mattered. A competent captain or boatswain could inspire calm and efficiency, while a harsh or inattentive leader could doom even the most disciplined crew. As the voyage progressed, monotony and minor crises merged into a steady rhythm that defined life at sea. Some days were filled with repetitive labor, windless drifting, and routine checks of provisions. Other days erupted in short bursts of intense activity, whether due to storms, equipment failures, or encounters with other ships. Sailors came to understand that survival required more than physical skill. It demanded psychological endurance, patience, and the ability to work under both boredom and pressure. Amid this demanding routine, the sailors' sense of time blurred. Days were measured less by hours than by the tasks completed. Sails adjusted, decks swabbed, cargo secured. Sleep became irregular, often snatched in short bursts between watches. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, though their severity fluctuated with rationing and luck. Even small victories, a secured mast, a successfully repaired sail, or spotting land after weeks of open sea, offered disproportionate relief. These moments reinforced the precariousness of life afloat. Survival was never guaranteed, only bought in incremental steps of effort and vigilance. Yet even as sailors adjusted to the daily grind, the underlying question of endurance persisted. How would they withstand weeks of isolation, scarcity, and exposure? How would they respond when a storm struck with no warning, or when illness incapacitated half the crew? The initial calm of setting sail had faded, replaced by the slow, steady realization that the sea demanded a constant, quiet vigilance. And as they gazed at the horizon, day after day, one question lingered. When the inevitable disaster came, would their skills, discipline, and endurance be enough to see them through it? Weeks, or sometimes months into a voyage, the sea stopped being merely a backdrop to labor and monotony. It became an omnipresent force, shaping every thought, every movement, and every moment of consciousness. The sailors who had departed from port full of anticipation now confronted the full weight of isolation, exposure, and the relentless demand for skill and endurance. By this stage, the line between routine and survival had blurred. Tasks that had once seemed tedious coiling rope, swabbing the deck, measuring provisions were now directly linked to the very chance of living through another day. Storms were no longer hypothetical. They arrived with the sudden ferocity that only the open ocean can produce. The sailors had long learned to anticipate the warning signs, the peculiar swell of waves, the gathering density of clouds, the changing cries of seabirds. Yet even with experience, the first real storm was an overwhelming trial. Wind whipped at the sails, tearing them with deafening rips. Rain lashed sideways, drenching the crew despite their coarse woolen garments. The deck pitched beneath their feet, making balance a dangerous challenge. Each rope pulled, each mast secured, each sail furled was an exercise in precision under extreme physical stress. Fatigue became a constant companion, a shadow that made every decision heavier. In the midst of the storm, hierarchy and discipline revealed their essential purpose. The captain and boatswain coordinated maneuvers with terse, shouted commands. Confusion could be fatal. One misplaced knot, one untied sail, or a moment's hesitation could result in a mast snapping, cargo shifting, or even men being swept overboard. Sailors clung to the rigging, muscles burning, while others below deck struggled to secure barrels and prevent them from crushing the sleeping or incapacitated. The chaos was immense, yet beneath it all, the meticulous training of repetitive labor began to pay off. Decades of learned habits, Coiling rope, tightening, rigging, adjusting sails, allowed sailors to react instinctively, and instinct was survival in the storm. Even when the worst of the storm passed, its aftermath brought new challenges. Rations had been spoiled by seawater, minor injuries had become infected, and morale had plunged under exhaustion. Sailors counted their number carefully, noting who had survived the night's ordeal. Scurvy and dysentery claimed others silently, weakening the crew without drama. Death at sea was rarely sudden or heroic. It often arrived quietly, leaving behind the stark reminder that life was a fragile commodity. Those who survived understood that endurance was not simply a matter of strength, but of careful attention, skill, and unyielding routine. As the days returned to calmer waters, a new kind of challenge emerged: the mental toll of isolation. Weeks of endless horizon and monotonous tasks pressed on the mind. Sailors became attuned to every creak of timber, every rustle below deck, every subtle change in the sea. Conversations grew rare and economical. Men observed each other in silence, sharing unspoken assessments of competence and resilience. Oddly, this monotony of awareness created a rhythm that sustained life, even if it eroded the notion of personal time. Sleep remained fitful, food meager, but the routine itself became a source of comfort. It was a method to impose order on the chaos of the ocean. Port towns, when finally sighted, brought a mixture of relief and new labor. Docking a ship was no simple matter. It required precise navigation, coordination, and continued physical exertion. Sailors, though exhausted, had to maintain vigilance until the vessel was securely moored. Cargo had to be unloaded, sails repaired, ropes coiled, and the hull inspected. Even in port, life did not ease completely. Illnesses had to be tended, the dead buried or accounted for, and supplies replenished for the next leg of the journey. Yet there was a temporary reprieve, a moment to stretch, to wash, and to eat fresh food before the cycle of labor and vigilance resumed. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of survival was the social dimension. Life at sea forged bonds, unlike those on land. Sailors relied on one another for every critical task, adjusting sails, hauling ropes, tending to the sick, and securing cargo. Trust was mandatory, not optional, and the crew's cohesion often determined whether a ship survived storms or grounded upon rocks. Arguments and rivalries could not be ignored, but neither could they be allowed to fester. Discipline, loyalty, and shared labor were the threads that wove the crew into a functional unit capable of surviving the worst the sea could offer. Yet, survival was never absolute. Despite careful navigation, skill, and communal effort, the sea remained unpredictable. Ships ran aground, storms destroyed masts, disease claimed lives, and piracy or hostile vessels could strip cargo or life itself. Sailors learned, over repeated voyages, that luck was as important as skill, and that no preparation could entirely mitigate risk. Their resilience was not heroic in a cinematic sense. It was practical, mechanical, and born of repetition. Every day was about small victories: keeping a rope tight, preventing rot in the hull, rationing food and water, patching a sail before it tore entirely. Life was measured in incremental successes rather than grand triumphs. The culmination of a voyage often passed without fanfare. Ships arrived, battered but afloat, and the sailors stepped onto solid ground, sometimes fewer in number than when they had departed. Families greeted survivors, merchants counted profits, and captains tallied losses. Some men immediately returned home, exhausted and unwilling to risk another journey. Others, conditioned by repetition and the subtle rhythm of the sea, prepared for the next voyage almost immediately, accepting that the cycle of monotony and danger was inescapable. These men had internalized the lessons of endurance, rhythm, and human reliance that defined medieval sailing life. The most profound lesson of all, however, was subtle. Survival at sea required embracing the ordinary as extraordinary. The laborious repetition of mundane tasks, tying knots, scrubbing decks, securing cargo, was not boring in a trivial sense. It was a form of mastery that ensured life in an environment indifferent to human effort. The mundane became heroic, simply because it mattered. A sailor who could perform these tasks day after day, month after month, in wet, cold, and dangerous conditions, embodied resilience in its quietest, most understated form. As these medieval sailors reflected on their experiences, the sea became a teacher of patience, humility, and endurance. Life's fragility was apparent in every ration, every rope, every wave. Yet within that fragility was a framework for understanding human persistence. The quiet, unglamorous work of preparation, observation, and attention could outweigh brute strength or fleeting bravery. The open ocean, vast and indifferent, had reduced human existence to its simplest components: survive, endure, cooperate, and persist. And so, as sailors stepped back onto land, washed and rested, they carried with them not only scars and stories, but a subtle comprehension of survival that few on land could imagine. Their voyages may not have been legendary in the traditional sense, but their endurance, discipline, and mastery of the mundane ensured that trade, exploration, and human connection continued across seas. The question that lingered as they gazed at the waves that had just tested them remained unresolved for every sailor who would ever embark again. How many of these lessons would survive the next storm, and how many would the sea take with it, hidden beneath waves and forgotten in time? The North Sea is a body of water that has shaped history through its relentless moods. Unlike the calm Mediterranean or the predictable trade winds of the Atlantic, the North Sea is a place of extremes, a region where weather and currents can shift in minutes, and where the difference between survival and disaster is measured in inches. For medieval sailors, the North Sea was both a highway for commerce and a graveyard for the unwary. Its reputation for shipwrecks, storms, and hidden dangers was well earned, and every sailor who ventured into it understood that preparation was not optional, but a matter of life and death. The first challenge of the North Sea was its weather, which could change with frightening speed. In the morning, a sailor might experience calm waters and gentle winds. By afternoon, dark clouds could gather on the horizon, winds gusting into squalls that tossed even the sturdiest ships. Rain, hail, and freezing spray were common, and winter voyages were particularly brutal. Sailors in the medieval period had no accurate meteorological tools beyond observation and lore, relying on the sky, the clouds, and the behavior of seabirds to anticipate changes. A single misjudgment could mean being caught in a storm far from safe harbor, with only crude sails and wooden hulls to protect them. Currents and tides added a second layer of danger. The North Sea is shallow in many areas, with sandbanks and shifting mudflats that could ground even experienced crews. Tides were powerful, sometimes reversing the direction of water flow within hours. Sailors learned to calculate these shifts, noting the timing of tides at each port and along each stretch of coast. Knowledge of local waters was essential. A captain unfamiliar with these nuances could easily run aground, leaving the ship vulnerable to storms and waves. Maps existed, but they were rudimentary, often inaccurate, and sometimes dangerously misleading. Ship design played a crucial role in survival. Medieval cogs, the primary vessels used in the North Sea, were relatively sturdy but slow. They had high sides, a single mast, and square sails, which made them stable in moderate conditions but awkward in strong winds. The hulls were deep and rounded, capable of carrying significant cargo, but prone to rolling in choppy waters. Wooden pegs and iron nails held the ship together, while tar and pitch protected the hull from constant exposure to salt water. Maintenance was ongoing. Even minor cracks could lead to catastrophic leaks, and every voyage demanded careful inspection of timbers, masts, and rigging. Sailors were constantly on alert for signs of wear, for the sea could exploit even the smallest weakness in a vessel's structure. Preparation for a North Sea voyage went beyond the physical. Sailors carried knowledge passed down through generations, stories of previous storms, hidden shoals, and narrow escapes. Some captains employed guides familiar with coastal waters, while others relied on oral tradition to anticipate hazards. Supplies were critical: salted meat, dried fish, hardtack, and barrels of beer or weak wine to supplement limited fresh water. Every ration was calculated to last longer than expected, for delays were common. A storm could leave a ship adrift for days, or even weeks, without the chance to replenish provisions. The mental calculation of survival, ration by ration, became a quiet but constant preoccupation of the crew. Once at sea, the monotony of labor was interrupted by a constant awareness of danger. Sailors spent hours coiling ropes, adjusting sails, and checking cargo, but their minds never left the horizon. Clouds, wave patterns, and wind direction were studied relentlessly. The sea could appear calm, even inviting, while beneath its surface lay hidden currents and sudden shoals. Every change was significant, every distraction could be fatal. Even a moment's carelessness, stepping on a wet deck at the wrong time, misjudging the tension on a rope, failing to notice a tide change could end in disaster. The storms of the North Sea were notorious. Squalls, with winds reaching hurricane strength, could sweep across the water, tossing ships like toys. Waves often rose unpredictably, their heights magnified by shallow seabeds. Sailors describe feeling the ship rise and fall as if suspended in a giant hand, with water cascading over the sides and smashing into the deck. Securing the vessel was a continuous task. Sails had to be furled, ropes tightened, and the cargo lashed to prevent shifting that could capsize the ship. Every sailor, from the newest recruit to the seasoned veteran, had a specific role in weathering the storm. Mistakes were not forgiven. Shipwrecks were common, and their causes varied. Many resulted from storms, of course, but others were the product of human error or simple misfortune. A poorly navigated coast, a misread tide, or rotted timbers could leave a vessel stranded or broken against rocks. Survivors of shipwrecks often told grim tales. Men clinging to fragments of wood, huddled together in freezing water, waiting hours or days before reaching shore, or never reaching it at all. Even those who survived physical danger faced the mental toll. Trauma, fear, and the realization that survival was largely a matter of luck. Trade routes across the North Sea heightened these risks. Medieval Europe relied on maritime commerce to move essential goods: fish, wool, salt, timber, and later, spices from farther afield. These voyages were time-sensitive, and captains often pressed on despite worsening conditions. Economic pressure sometimes outweighed safety, and the loss of a single ship could devastate a merchant's livelihood. Sailors understood that their survival was tied not only to skill and vigilance, but also to the broader forces of commerce and human greed. The stakes were always high. Failure meant death at sea, financial ruin, or both. Daily life during these voyages was a delicate balance of monotony and acute awareness. The work itself, coiling ropes, tending sails, swabbing decks, remained repetitive, yet every action had a practical purpose. Sailors learned to monitor subtle changes: the lurch of the ship indicating a hidden sandbank, the scent of the sea before a storm, the behavior of birds near shore. This combination of dull repetition and acute observation was central to survival. It honed the mind to notice details that might otherwise be dismissed, and it fostered a constant, quiet vigilance. Despite the danger, sailors developed rituals and routines to cope with stress. Small superstitions, avoiding certain knots, carrying lucky charms, or observing specific prayers, offered psychological comfort. Shared stories of past disasters became a kind of oral history, teaching younger sailors through example rather than instruction. Even the simplest acts, like swabbing the deck or securing barrels, became symbolic gestures of control over a chaotic and unpredictable environment. These rituals were not merely cultural. They were practical methods of instilling order and maintaining morale under conditions that tested both body and mind. The North Sea demanded endurance in every form: physical, mental, and social. Sailors learned that cooperation was essential. A storm could render individual skill meaningless without the support of the crew. Hierarchy, discipline, and mutual trust were constantly tested. Arguments could be deadly distractions. Camaraderie could save lives. In every action, sailors balanced effort with strategy, constantly adapting to the mercurial conditions of this harsh maritime world. As the ship pushed deeper into the North Sea, leaving familiar ports behind, sailors became acutely aware of the vastness of their environment. Land disappeared from sight, leaving only the relentless horizon. Waves stretched endlessly, sky met water in a thin, uncertain line, and time itself became difficult to measure. This isolation brought introspection and quiet fear, as men contemplated the fragility of human existence. How many would see the next port? How many would succumb to disease, injury, or the indifferent fury of the sea? Even the strongest sailors recognized that survival was never guaranteed, only earned through discipline, endurance, and sometimes sheer luck. And as the ship moved forward, every sailor could not help but wonder, when the inevitable storm arrived, or when a hidden shoal claimed its prey, would they have the skill, patience, and resilience to survive, or would the North Sea take them, as it had taken so many before? Once the North Sea revealed its true nature, a sailor's life became an exercise in constant vigilance. The first signs of a storm were subtle. A sudden chill in the wind, a darkening of clouds on the horizon, or the restless movement of seabirds as they sought shelter. Experienced sailors, who had spent years traversing these waters, could often anticipate the storm's arrival hours before it struck in full fury. Yet even the most seasoned captain knew that forecasting was imperfect. The sea could defy expectation, and the boundary between caution and catastrophe was slim. When a storm broke, the transformation of the environment was immediate and dramatic. Calm waves became towering walls of water, foaming and rolling with a ferocity that dwarfed the ship beneath them. Rain and hail lashed sideways, driven by wind gusts that could snap masts if the crew was not diligent. Visibility dropped to near zero, leaving sailors reliant on instinct, experience, and shouted commands to navigate the chaos. Every action, from securing the sails to adjusting the rudder, became a matter of survival. Misjudgment at this stage could have fatal consequences. The ship itself, a medieval cog or small merchant vessel, responded with both resilience and fragility. The hull, though sturdy, rolled and pitched violently. Cargo shifted despite careful lashing, threatening to unbalance the vessel. Every rope strain, every knot, every tension on a sail mattered. Sailors scrambled across slippery decks, muscles burning, gripping ropes and masts as the ship twisted beneath them. The storm's violence rendered the ordinary tasks of sailing extraordinary. Hauling sails was no longer routine, it was lifeboat work. Each successful maneuver was a temporary victory against the sea's relentless power. Beneath deck, conditions were equally perilous. Water sloshed into the hold, soaking barrels of food and supplies. The living quarters, cramped and poorly ventilated, became a mixture of damp, cold, and rot. Sailors who were ill or exhausted faced compounded risk. Even minor injuries could escalate quickly. A rope burn might turn septic, or a fractured limb might impede the ability to perform essential tasks. In such moments, survival depended not just on individual skill, but on the vigilance and cooperation of the entire crew. Crew members often formed ad hoc rescue teams, dragging the injured to safety or bailing water to keep the ship afloat. Coordination, discipline, and shared effort were the difference between endurance and disaster. The mental strain of storms was profound. Sailors faced a relentless test of focus, fear management, and stamina. The roar of wind, the crash of waves, and the sensation of being tossed in a vessel barely larger than a cottage eroded both body and mind. Fear, if allowed to dominate, could paralyze. Exhaustion could cause mistakes. Veteran sailors developed subtle mental strategies, focusing on repetitive tasks, counting ropes, observing small environmental cues, or silently reciting prayers. These methods were as much about survival as skill. They provided a psychological anchor amid chaos, allowing the mind to remain functional under conditions of extreme stress. Navigation during a storm was especially perilous. Without modern instruments, sailors relied on instinct and memory, guided by the ship's movement and sporadic glimpses of sky or stars between clouds. Coastal features, often familiar in calm conditions, could become deadly traps when obscured by waves or rain. Misjudging the tide or drifting too close to a sandbank could result in grounding, capsizing, or destruction of the vessel. Even the most meticulous preparation offered no guarantee of success. The sea demanded both respect and humility. Shipwrecks in the North Sea were frequent and harrowing. Tales circulated in port towns of vessels dashed upon rocks, crews forced into icy waters, and cargo lost forever. Some survivors recalled floating on wreckage for hours or days, exposed to cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The probability of rescue was low. Coastal geography often prevented quick access, and storms could persist long enough that the wrecked ship became another casualty in a chain of disasters. Sailors came to accept, grimly, that survival was a combination of preparation, skill, and chance, and that some elements were entirely beyond human control. Food and water became a critical concern during extended storms. Barrels of fresh water sloshed, sometimes contaminating supplies, and saltwater intrusion spoiled provisions. Hardtack, once monotonous, became essential, its dry, tasteless substance a lifeline. Beer and weak wine were rationed carefully, not only for consumption, but to supplement contaminated water. Sailors ate mechanically, driven less by hunger than by necessity. Even the act of chewing hardtack became a small ritual of endurance, a tangible reminder of life preserved in the face of relentless chaos. Disease compounded the difficulty. Exposure to cold and damp weakened immune systems, while cramped, unsanitary conditions fostered illness. Scurvy, dysentery, and respiratory infections moved silently through the crew. Injuries from falls, rope burns, or falling cargo became dangerous when left untreated. Survival required constant attention, checking on comrades, redistributing labor, and sometimes improvising remedies from meager stores. Sailors often relied on traditional methods, rubbing infected wounds with vinegar, applying herbs, or observing old maritime superstitions. These measures were imperfect, but represented the only tools available in the medieval toolkit of survival. Social cohesion was tested more intensely than in calm waters. Tensions that might have been minor on a routine day could escalate quickly under the stress of storm conditions. Arguments over duties, disputes over rations, or resentment of seniority could become dangerous distractions. Yet cooperation was essential. Crew members developed subtle non-verbal communication, a glance indicating readiness, a gesture to indicate an obstruction, or the coordinated heave of multiple men on a rope. Leadership was critical. A captain who maintained calm and authority could prevent panic, whereas indecision or rage could doom the vessel. As storms subsided, survivors emerged, physically exhausted but mentally changed. The sea, with its unpredictability and overwhelming force, instilled a heightened awareness of risk and endurance. Sailors developed what might be called a routine intuition, the automatic recognition of threats, the ability to act decisively, and the patience to continue monotonous but essential labor under adverse conditions. These traits were not born of heroism or luck alone. They were cultivated through experience, observation, and the relentless repetition of mundane tasks that became extraordinary under stress. Even when reaching relative calm, the North Sea remained unforgiving. Wreckage could be spotted floating miles from the last storm. The dead, or injured, were reminders of the fragility of life. Sailors learned to respect the ocean's power, knowing that survival was always provisional. A successful passage did not guarantee safety on the return trip, and each voyage demanded renewed vigilance. It was a world in which the extraordinary arose from the ordinary. Tying a secure knot, checking the hull for leaks, or rationing provisions became acts of heroism in the absence of dramatic battles or mythical adventures. As the crew looked ahead toward the hoped-for safety of a distant port, one thought lingered among them. Storms are inevitable, misfortune is unavoidable, and yet the cycle continues. The North Sea claimed its due. Yet it also created resilient men, capable of surviving where others might perish. The ultimate question remained unresolved. When the next storm came, and it always would their skill, patience, and cohesion be enough? Or would the sea, indifferent and relentless, claim another vessel and its crew? As the North Sea continued its relentless rhythm, the inevitability of shipwrecks became apparent to every sailor aboard. Even the most seasoned crews, with careful preparation and tireless labor, could be undone by the combination of weather, tides, and simple misfortune. Shipwrecks were not dramatic events of cinematic heroism. They were long, exhausting struggles against both environment and circumstance. A slow unraveling in which every decision could mean life or death. One storm, like many before it, approached with little warning. Clouds gathered, dark and heavy, and a chill swept across the deck. Sailors scrambled to secure sails and cargo, shouting orders over the wind and spray. The waves grew taller, tossing the ship like a cork, while barrels and crates rolled across the deck with violent force. A sudden gust caught the mainsail, snapping ropes and nearly pulling the topmast overboard. Every sailor acted instinctively, hauling ropes, bracing against the pitch of the deck, and assisting those who had slipped or been struck by shifting cargo. It was a test of endurance, skill, and coordination, one that would leave no margin for error. Even when the crew performed perfectly, disaster could strike. The North Sea's shallow sandbanks and hidden rocks were merciless. A sudden surge of water pushed the vessel off course, grounding the ship with a shudder that ran through every timber. The hull groaned under pressure. Water began to seep into the hold. Sailors leapt to action, bailing water with buckets, reinforcing bulkheads, and attempting to lighten the load by throwing cargo overboard. Yet the grinding of the keel against stone was relentless, and the ship's survival became increasingly uncertain. The chaos of shipwreck was both physical and psychological. Fear and exhaustion mingled with the practical necessity of labor. Sailors worked in teams, shouting over the roar of wind and waves, coordinating every action to prevent catastrophe. Injuries were common. Rope burns, bruises, and cuts from splintered wood compounded the danger. Those below deck had to contend with rising water, wet cargo, and the constant risk of being trapped. Survival demanded not only strength and skill, but trust. Each man relied on his comrades to act without hesitation, to anticipate problems, and to cover one another's weaknesses. Some crews were fortunate. With skill and luck, they managed to free the vessel from grounding, repair critical damage, and limp to calmer waters. In these instances, the storm became a lesson in endurance, observation, and teamwork. Sailors reinforced their bonds through shared experience, noting every misstep and success. Yet even in these near-miraculous survivals, losses were recorded. Damaged cargo, minor injuries, and the haunting realization of what could have happened. For others, the North Sea proved fatal. The hull might split under pressure, the ship capsizing in a final, merciless wave. Survivors clung to debris, exposed to freezing water, relentless winds, and exhaustion. Rescue was uncertain, often dependent on passing ships or reaching a distant shore. Many succumbed to hypothermia, hunger, or injury before safety could be attained. These tragic outcomes were part of the silent calculus of medieval seafaring. Life was provisional, success measured in small increments, and death a constant companion. Shipwrecks also revealed the ingenuity and resourcefulness of sailors. Those who survived improvised constantly. Rafts from broken timbers, ropes fashioned into flotation aids, or shared warmth through huddling together in freezing conditions. Knowledge passed down through generations, stories of previous wrecks, techniques for holding onto debris, and strategies for rationing meager supplies became literal lifelines. Even in the face of apparent doom, these lessons from the past increased the odds of survival, highlighting the quiet intelligence embedded in experience and tradition. The aftermath of a shipwreck, for those fortunate enough to reach shore, was an extension of the struggle. Sailors had to navigate treacherous coastlines, find food and shelter, and tend to injuries. In many North Sea regions, settlements were sparse, and aid could be delayed. The mental toll was enormous. Fear, trauma, and exhaustion compounded the physical challenges of exposure, hunger, and injury. Recovery was slow, and many survivors carried both physical scars and psychological burdens that would influence subsequent voyages. Surviving the North Sea also meant navigating the social and economic consequences of disaster. Merchants counted losses, sailors waited for payment, and captains faced scrutiny or blame. Lives were evaluated not only in terms of survival, but in terms of economic outcomes. Lost cargo could ruin a voyage financially, while the loss of men could strain crews for future journeys. Sailors learned to negotiate this harsh reality, balancing survival against economic necessity and understanding that life at sea was intertwined with both human ambition and the uncontrollable forces of nature. Yet amidst the danger and loss, there were lessons that endured. Repetition and routine, seemingly mundane on a calm day, became essential to survival in the storm. Coiling ropes, checking timbers, bailing water, rationing food. These tasks, performed over and over, created a framework for resilience, observation and anticipation, patience and coordination, trust and discipline. These qualities were honed through experience, producing sailors capable of facing the sea's extremes with a measured, methodical endurance. The extraordinary arose from the ordinary. A tied knot, a secured barrel, a carefully observed tide line became acts of heroism in context. The difference between life and death. Even after months at sea and multiple encounters with storms, sailors returned to port with a quiet, measured understanding of their world. They had faced the North Sea's wrath and survived not through luck alone, but through skill, preparation, and relentless perseverance. Ships had been damaged, lives lost, yet those who endured carried knowledge that would serve both themselves and future crews. Their stories, though rarely dramatic in the conventional sense, reflected the intersection of human resilience and the indifferent power of nature. The ultimate lesson of the North Sea was clear. Survival required embracing the mundane, mastering it, and applying it under pressure. The storm was not a singular event, but a continuum, a series of tasks, observations, and decisions that accumulated into life or death. Sailors understood that heroism was not always dramatic. It often consisted of repetition, discipline, and quiet cooperation. In a world where the sea claimed its due without prejudice, these qualities were the only guarantee of survival. And as the crew returned to the familiar sight of port, rebuilding their vessel, tending to injuries, and preparing for the next voyage, one thought lingered persistently. No matter how many storms they survived, no matter how carefully they navigated, the North Sea would always be waiting, indifferent and unforgiving, ready to claim what it could. The question remained for every sailor who would venture back. Would the next voyage reward skill and preparation, or would the sea, relentless as ever, determine the outcome itself? Imagine standing on the deck of a medieval ship, the endless expanse of ocean stretching in every direction, with no compass, no GPS, and no radio. The horizon blends into the sky in muted shades of grey or blue, and your only guide is what you can see, feel, and remember. For medieval sailors, navigation was both art and science, a mixture of careful observation, practical knowledge, and traditions passed down over generations. Before the compass became common in Northern Europe in the 14th century, sailors relied on the sun, stars, wind, waves, and an intimate knowledge of coastal geography to find their way across often treacherous waters. One of the primary tools for navigation was the sun itself. During daylight, sailors used its position to estimate direction and, to some extent, latitude. They memorized the sun's trajectory across the sky at different times of the year and used this knowledge to maintain a general course. On cloudy days, however, this method became unreliable, and sailors were forced to rely on other cues. Wind patterns, for example, provided both opportunities and challenges. Certain winds were predictable in particular regions and seasons, and knowing how to read them was crucial for both speed and safety. A sudden change in wind direction could force a ship off course or into hazardous areas, making observation a constant necessity. The stars, of course, were the most critical guide during the night. Sailors memorized constellations, learned the positions of key stars, and used their relative positions to maintain course. Polaris, the North Star, offered a fixed point in the northern hemisphere, helping sailors determine direction even when the horizon was obscured. But reading the stars required practice and careful observation. Cloud cover, fog, and the rolling motion of the ship complicated every calculation. Experienced sailors learned to account for the ship's movement, adjusting their estimates as they tracked celestial bodies. The practice required patience, focus, and a steady hand, even under the exhausting conditions of life at sea. Another indispensable method was dead reckoning. This involved keeping a record of speed, direction, and time traveled from a known point. Sailors measured speed using a log line, a rope knotted at regular intervals and thrown overboard, with the number of knots passing through their fingers in a given time, giving an estimate of speed, hence the origin of the term knots for nautical miles. By combining this information with course direction, a sailor could estimate the ship's position even when no land or celestial markers were visible. Errors accumulated quickly, however. Misjudging the speed, drifting with currents, or changing course even slightly could result in weeks of deviation from the intended path. It was an imperfect science, reliant on skill, memory, and constant vigilance. Currents and tides were additional guides. Coastal waters often had predictable currents that could aid or hinder progress. Sailors had to understand these patterns, observing the movement of buoys, driftwood, and seaweed to anticipate obstacles and optimize their route. Tides, particularly in shallow or narrow waters, could make navigation treacherous. A miscalculation could leave a vessel stranded on sandbanks or slammed against rocks. Some regions, like the North Sea or the English Channel, were notorious for complex tidal patterns, and only experience or guidance from local pilots could ensure safe passage. Pilots and guides played a crucial role in medieval navigation. Knowledge was often localized and practical, rather than theoretical. Coastal pilots would lead ships through dangerous waters, sharing oral instructions, landmarks, and timing for tides and winds. This knowledge was highly valued, often earning pilots respect and wages far higher than ordinary sailors. Even with these guides, however, errors were common, and the margin for mistake was narrow. Navigation relied heavily on observation, memory, and judgment skills that took years to master. Maps and charts existed, but they were rudimentary and often unreliable. Early Portolan charts, used primarily in the Mediterranean, offered coastal outlines and compass roses, but they lacked the accuracy needed for precise navigation over long distances. Some maps included fantastical elements, illustrating sea monsters, whirlpools, or mysterious islands that may or may not have existed. Medieval sailors had to interpret these representations carefully, combining them with personal experience and local knowledge. A map could guide, but it could not replace skill, observation, and prudence. Sailors also relied on natural signs beyond the sky and water. The behavior of birds, for example, provided clues about proximity to land. Certain species would not venture far from shore, so spotting them could indicate that land was near. Wave patterns offered subtle hints about underwater topography and the presence of hazards. Observing the color of the water, the presence of floating vegetation, or the motion of swells could reveal reefs, shoals, or currents invisible to the naked eye. These small cues were critically important in an era when instruments were limited and the margin for error was slim. Life at sea demanded more than physical skill. It required constant mental engagement. Sailors kept informal logs in their minds or on scraps of parchment, noting wind changes, star positions, currents, and landmarks. They learned to estimate distance traveled by observing drift, the passage of the sun, or changes in the color and movement of water. Mistakes were inevitable, and errors in navigation could lead to missed ports, lost cargo, or shipwreck. The psychological strain of responsibility for the ship's course added to the exhaustion from labor, storms, and the monotony of daily life. Interestingly, navigation was also a social activity. Knowledge was shared, debated, and taught among sailors, captains, and pilots. Younger or less experienced crew members observed the techniques of elders, learning to read the subtle cues of wind and water. Instruction was often oral, relying on observation, imitation, and repetition, rather than formalized study. A single voyage could teach more than months of theory, reinforcing lessons in ways that were practical, immediate, and sometimes life-saving. Even the act of standing on deck, observing the horizon, or noting subtle changes in color, light, and texture was part of the navigation process. Sailors developed a constant, quiet vigilance, attuned to details most people would overlook. Each wave, each breeze, each star, each bird, and even the smell of the air carried meaning. The line between ordinary labor and survival was thin. Tying a knot, adjusting a sail, or observing the drift of the ship could have consequences far beyond the immediate task. For those who mastered these methods, the open sea offered both risk and reward. Trade, exploration, and communication depended on the ability to reach distant ports reliably. Those who failed could be lost to the ocean, forgotten beneath waves and storms, leaving behind only tales of caution. Navigating without a compass was not an adventure story of heroism. It was a day-to-day test of endurance, observation, skill, and memory. Survival depended on mastering the ordinary, paying attention to tiny details, and applying knowledge consistently over weeks and months. As a voyage progressed, sailors came to understand the limits of their knowledge. Even experienced navigators could not account for every variable. Storms could obscure stars, currents could carry a ship off course, and shifting tides could render familiar landmarks treacherous. Survival depended on combining all available methods: celestial observation, dead reckoning, local knowledge, and careful attention to wind and waves. It was a delicate balance, maintained through skill, discipline, and continuous vigilance. And as the ship sailed toward an uncertain destination, the sailors silently contemplated a question that had haunted mariners for generations. Without the compass, without precise charts, and with only observation and memory to guide them, could they truly master the sea? Or were they forever at the mercy of forces beyond their control? After weeks, or even months at sea, a sailor began to understand the ocean as a living, shifting entity. Unlike land, which offered fixed reference points and predictable paths, the open water demanded constant adaptation. In medieval navigation, success relied not only on stars, tides, and winds, but on reading the subtle, almost invisible currents that shaped the ship's course without the crew realizing it until miscalculations became evident. Currents could carry a ship hundreds of miles off course if left unobserved, subtly counteracting the careful efforts of rudder and sail. Sailors developed a keen, almost instinctive understanding of water movement. They observed the surface for small anomalies, streaks of foam indicating subsurface turbulence, the drift of seaweed hinting at underwater obstacles, or subtle changes in wave direction caused by the confluence of two currents. Even the temperature and color of the water provided clues. Darker patches sometimes indicated deeper waters or underwater cliffs, while areas of lighter color suggested sandbanks or shallow shoals. Experienced sailors learned to integrate these visual cues with knowledge of tides and wind patterns, constantly adjusting the ship's course to compensate for hidden forces. Dead reckoning, while imperfect, became more sophisticated over time. Sailors kept mental or physical logs, noting the distance covered in a given time, the estimated speed of the ship, and the direction traveled. Each night, celestial observations were used to check these calculations. If a star appeared slightly off from its expected position relative to the horizon, the navigator would know that currents, wind, or misjudgment had shifted the ship's position. Adjustments could then be made, often requiring painstaking repetition of small maneuvers over hours or even days. The process demanded patience, focus, and a steady hand, as even minor errors could accumulate, resulting in catastrophic deviation from intended routes. The North Sea and the English Channel, in particular, tested these skills rigorously. Shallow waters, strong tides, and unpredictable storms created conditions in which even experienced navigators could miscalculate. Sandbanks moved over time, channels shifted, and markers used to estimate position were often unreliable. Sailors compensated by maintaining continuous observation, comparing the behavior of water and wildlife against remembered patterns from previous voyages. Mistakes were costly. Running aground could destroy cargo, ruin a ship, or leave a crew stranded in freezing conditions. Navigating along coastlines offered some relief, but introduced other challenges. While land offered reference points, coastal waters often concealed hidden dangers. Reefs, rocks, and sudden shallows required vigilance and experience. Sailors memorized distinctive features, cliffs, inlets, unusual trees, and rock formations, and used them as markers. They paid attention to the depth of the water, the speed of the current, and the presence of driftwood. Local pilots, when available, supplemented this knowledge. But even they could misjudge tides or currents under unusual conditions. Every voyage demanded careful observation, adaptation, and collective judgment. Sailors also learned to interpret atmospheric signs as part of their navigational toolkit. Clouds, wind shifts, and even temperature changes offered subtle indicators of approaching storms or shifts in current. Low, dense clouds suggested strong winds, while sudden gusts or changes in wave patterns indicated a shift in current direction. Some sailors observed the smell of the air, noting that certain scents, like damp marshes or distant vegetation, could indicate proximity to land. These observations, combined with traditional knowledge, created a complex, multi-layered approach to navigation that relied equally on logic and intuition. The social dimension of navigation was significant as well. Knowledge was rarely codified formally. It was passed through apprenticeship and observation. Young sailors shadowed experienced crew members, learning the nuances of celestial observation, tidal calculation, and interpreting environmental cues. Mistakes were instructive, often remembered for years as cautionary tales. Crew members worked as a unit, not only performing physical labor, but also collectively interpreting the invisible signs of the sea. Communication was crucial. A subtle signal from a lookout, a whispered observation about cloud movement, or a shared understanding of drift direction could mean the difference between reaching port safely and disaster. Navigators also relied on ingenuity when tools were limited. Simple instruments, like the kamal, a small wooden device used to measure the angle of stars, or the sounding lead, a weighted line for measuring water depth, became invaluable for calculating position. Even rudimentary tools required skill. The sailor had to account for the motion of the ship, the angle of the line, and variations in depth due to tides. These calculations were often repeated multiple times a day, providing continuous feedback on the accuracy of dead reckoning. Each success reinforced confidence. Each error highlighted the thin margin separating survival from peril. Despite their expertise, sailors understood the limits of their knowledge. The ocean was unpredictable, and every voyage carried inherent risk. Storms could render stars invisible, obscuring celestial markers. Currents could shift unexpectedly, or an unusual tidal pattern could mislead even the most vigilant navigator. Survival demanded humility. No matter how skilled, sailors were always at the mercy of forces they could only partially understand or influence. The tension between mastery and vulnerability was a constant presence, shaping every decision, every maneuver, and every observation. Interestingly, much of this knowledge was encoded in subtle rituals and routines. Checking the position of stars at specific times, measuring the depth at certain intervals, observing wave behavior, all became habitual, almost subconscious. These routines provided psychological stability, giving sailors a sense of control in an environment that was otherwise indifferent to human effort. Even mundane actions, tightening a rope, noting the drift of the ship, or marking progress on a crude chart were imbued with significance, contributing to the broader task of survival. For many sailors, the mastery of invisible currents and dead reckoning became a source of quiet pride. It was not a dramatic skill celebrated in chronicles or ballads, but it allowed men to traverse hundreds of miles of open water with a degree of certainty in an era before modern instruments. Success was measured incrementally, maintaining course through an overcast day, reaching a port slightly ahead of schedule, or avoiding a hidden shoal that could have destroyed the ship. Each small triumph reinforced the understanding that mastery of the mundane, the observation, calculation, and adaptation was the essence of navigation. As the voyage continued, sailors contemplated the delicate balance they maintained between skill, observation, and luck. Even the most meticulous preparation could be undone by a sudden storm or a misjudged current. Yet each successful course reinforced the methods and experience that would allow survival on subsequent journeys. Navigation before the compass was not glamorous, but it was vital. It required constant attention, collective judgment, and the integration of multiple, often subtle, observations into coherent action. And so, as the ship sailed onward, under clouded skies, stars hidden, and currents shifting beneath, sailors faced a persistent, unspoken question: could human skill truly conquer the uncertainty of the sea? Or was every journey merely a temporary success in an endless negotiation with forces far greater than themselves? After weeks at sea, with the horizon stretching endlessly and no compass to guide them, sailors came to understand the full weight of pre-modern navigation. Each day required vigilance, calculation, and adaptation to forces both visible and invisible. Stars, currents, tides, wind, and memory combined to create a fragile framework for survival, one that could be undone by a single error or misjudgment. These voyages were not stories of dramatic heroism. They were chronicles of endurance, observation, and resilience, where success was often measured by the quiet arrival at port rather than any celebrated triumph. When a ship finally approached land after weeks of open water navigation, the relief was palpable. Every sailor on deck would scan the horizon for familiar markers, cliffs, or river mouths. The culmination of countless hours of observation, mental calculation, and vigilance suddenly became tangible. Yet, even at this moment, danger remained. Sandbanks could lie hidden beneath deceptively calm water, tides could shift abruptly, and storm clouds could appear from the horizon without warning. Sailors had learned that arrival at port was never guaranteed. It was a reward earned through constant attention, routine labor, and an intimate understanding of the sea. Success stories of navigation before the compass often highlighted the quiet ingenuity of sailors. By carefully observing celestial bodies, using dead reckoning, and interpreting currents, crews were able to traverse hundreds of miles of open water with surprising accuracy. Experienced captains could estimate latitude by measuring the angle of stars above the horizon, or determine distance traveled by monitoring speed and time. They memorized coastal features and tidal patterns, creating a mental map that supplemented the rudimentary charts available at the time. Each voyage reinforced and refined this knowledge, allowing crews to undertake progressively longer and more ambitious journeys. Failures, however, were equally instructive. Ships occasionally ran aground, misjudged currents, or became lost in storms. Crew members who survived often endured physical exhaustion, hunger, exposure, and injuries. Sometimes the consequences were fatal. Men perished, cargo was lost, and entire voyages ended in tragedy. These failures were recorded in oral histories and informal logs, serving as warnings for future sailors. Each miscalculation contributed to the cumulative knowledge of navigation, gradually improving the chances of survival for subsequent generations. Even disasters had their lessons, underscoring the delicate balance between human skill and the unpredictable forces of nature. One remarkable aspect of pre-compass navigation was its reliance on cumulative knowledge and collective observation. No single sailor could master all variables alone. The The success of a voyage depended on cooperation and communication among the crew. Observations about currents, tides, and weather were shared, debated, and applied collaboratively. Mentorship played a critical role. Experienced sailors taught novices to read the stars, gauge speed, and interpret subtle signs in the water. This knowledge transfer was continuous, evolving with each voyage, and became a cornerstone of survival in the unpredictable environment of the open sea. Navigating without precise instruments also required psychological resilience. Sailors endured monotony, punctuated by moments of extreme danger. Routine labor, tying knots, coiling ropes, bailing water, was essential not just for the ship's integrity, but also for maintaining a rhythm that preserved mental stability. The repetition of these tasks allowed sailors to focus, creating a sense of control in an environment that offered little otherwise. Mental endurance was as important as physical stamina. Navigating in darkness, through storms, or across weeks of featureless water demanded concentration, memory, and composure. The arrival at port after a successful voyage was always bittersweet. Sailors celebrated the physical accomplishment and the relief of safety, yet the experience of survival left an indelible impression. The sea, vast and indifferent, had tested every skill, challenged every assumption, and reminded every man that human life at sea was provisional. Trade was completed, cargo delivered, and contracts fulfilled, but the cost of survival, both mental and physical, remained. The ordinary work of navigation, often dull and repetitive, had been elevated into a matter of life and death, teaching lessons far beyond the ship's deck. The broader implications of these voyages were significant. Navigation without a compass shaped trade, exploration, and cultural exchange in medieval Europe. Sailors who mastered dead reckoning, currents, and celestial observation enabled commerce to flow across the seas, connecting distant ports and economies. Knowledge accumulated from these voyages contributed to the gradual development of more sophisticated navigational tools, including the magnetic compass and improved charts. The endurance and ingenuity of medieval sailors laid the groundwork for the age of exploration centuries later, illustrating how survival and mastery of ordinary skills could shape the course of history. Even the smallest victories, keeping a ship on course during a storm, arriving slightly ahead of schedule, or avoiding a treacherous sandbank, were monumental achievements in the context of pre-compass navigation. These incremental successes represented the quiet triumph of human observation and adaptation over an environment that was vast, indifferent, and unpredictable. Sailors developed resilience, judgment, and an intimate understanding of forces invisible to those on land, creating a knowledge system that was practical, cumulative, and life-saving. In reflecting on these voyages, one sees that survival, in its most basic form, relied on understanding the mundane and applying it consistently, monitoring the angle of a star, noting the drift of the ship, checking rope tension, observing currents, and maintaining mental focus. All these seemingly ordinary acts were the threads from which survival was woven. Heroism did not always manifest in dramatic battles or storms, but in the continuous, methodical practice of skills that ensured life continued, despite constant risk. The question that haunted every sailor, however, remained unresolved. No matter how skilled, how vigilant, or how experienced, could a human truly master the sea, or was every voyage merely a temporary negotiation with forces beyond control? The North Star, drifting currents, and measured distances could guide them, but the sea itself remained sovereign, indifferent, powerful, and capable of undoing even the most meticulous navigation. The sailors' achievements were remarkable precisely because they succeeded in this context, illustrating the fragile, persistent, and ultimately human struggle to endure in a world governed by forces greater than themselves. Thus, the story of navigation before the compass concludes not with a dramatic victory, but with a profound understanding of endurance, observation, and human ingenuity. Medieval sailors learned that survival was neither guaranteed nor glamorous. It was methodical, measured, and dependent on the mastery of mundane tasks elevated to life-saving significance. Their legacy endures in the knowledge they accumulated, the routes they charted, and the quiet, persistent courage required to face the vast, indifferent horizon. If you imagine a medieval ship, the first image that often comes to mind is the deck. Sailors hauling ropes, adjusting sails, scanning the horizon. But beneath that exposed deck lay an entirely different world, one just as vital to survival, but far less visible. Life below deck was cramped, damp, and often unpleasant. Yet it was here that sailors spent much of their time, dealing with the invisible and slow-moving threats of disease, poor hygiene, and the constant struggle to maintain both physical and mental health during extended voyages. The ship's hold, where cargo was stored, often doubled as sleeping quarters for much of the crew. Space was limited, and comfort was nearly non-existent. Hammocks were rare. Most sailors slept on the wooden floor, on mats or planks with straw bedding when available. The air was thick with moisture from the sea, condensation from the ship itself, and the odors of rotting food or stagnant water. Ventilation was minimal, so the smells of salt, tar, fish, and unwashed bodies combined to create an almost constant assault on the senses. Sailors became accustomed to these conditions, developing a resilience that, while practical, also carried consequences for health over time. Hygiene, by modern standards, was rudimentary at best. Fresh water was scarce and carefully rationed for drinking and cooking, leaving little for washing. Sailors often went weeks without bathing, and clothing was seldom changed. Salt from sea spray quickly crusted onto skin and garments, fostering irritation and infection. Hair, nails, and skin became breeding grounds for lice, scabies, and fungal infections. Remedies were improvised. Sailors used vinegar, herbs, or brine to cleanse themselves, but these were only partially effective. The combination of dampness, heat from enclosed spaces, and lack of sanitation created conditions in which illness could spread rapidly, threatening the entire crew. Food and nutrition below deck were another constant concern. Long voyages required preserved foods. Hardtack, salted meat, dried fish, and legumes formed the bulk of the diet. Fresh fruit and vegetables were nearly impossible to carry for extended periods, leaving sailors vulnerable to deficiencies, particularly scurvy caused by a lack of vitamin C. Sailors were keenly aware of the slow deterioration of their rations. Barrels of salted meat could become rancid, dried fish could be infested with insects, and bread hardtack might soften or mold. The monotony and nutritional inadequacy of food had both physical and psychological effects, weakening the body and testing morale. Water, essential for life, was another challenge. Sailors relied on barrels of rainwater or fresh water taken on board at ports. Over time, water became contaminated, particularly when barrels leaked or were stored near salted cargo. Many sailors drank weak beer or wine to supplement their supply, as fermentation killed some harmful microbes. Still, dehydration and illness from poor quality water were persistent threats. The careful rationing of water became a daily concern, requiring both forethought and discipline. Every drop mattered, especially during storms or when delayed by weather. Disease was a constant, invisible threat below deck. Respiratory infections thrived in enclosed, damp spaces, spreading easily among sailors. Dysentery and gastrointestinal illnesses arose from spoiled food or contaminated water, while scurvy slowly weakened muscles, gums, and overall resilience. Injuries, minor burns, or cuts could become infected in the absence of proper care. Medical knowledge was limited. Remedies were a mix of superstition, herbal treatments, and improvised surgery. Sailors who survived long voyages often did so through careful attention to cleanliness, observation of symptoms, and mutual aid among crewmates, rather than sophisticated medical intervention. Mental strain was an additional hazard. Life below deck was monotonous, crowded, and noisy at times, yet silent and isolating at others. The constant rocking of the ship, the darkness, and the lack of space contributed to disorientation and fatigue. Sailors were acutely aware of the dangers above deck, the storms, waves, and threats of navigation, but below deck, the slow, insidious dangers of disease and malnutrition required equal attention. Mental resilience became essential, as despair or panic could exacerbate illness, create accidents, or diminish the ability to perform necessary tasks. Living quarters were also a space of social negotiation. Space was shared, privacy non-existent, and conflict could arise over sleeping arrangements, ration allocation, or personal hygiene. Crew hierarchy played a role in mediating these conflicts, with captains or senior sailors enforcing rules and ensuring cooperation. Discipline was not merely about authority, it was a mechanism for survival. Arguments over minor grievances could escalate dangerously in close quarters, and maintaining social cohesion was as critical to survival as securing sails in a storm. Sleeping below deck was not restful. The constant motion of the ship, the noise of shifting cargo, and the smells of the hold made sleep fragmented and fitful. Sailors developed habits to cope, napping in shifts, using clothing or bundles as makeshift pillows, and creating small personal spaces amid the chaos. Sleep deprivation compounded the effects of poor nutrition and disease, weakening both body and mind. A sailor's endurance was tested not only by storms or navigation, but by the slow accumulation of fatigue in these harsh conditions. Even routine maintenance below deck carried risks. Moving heavy barrels, securing cargo, or patching leaks in confined spaces required coordination and vigilance. Slippery surfaces, poorly lit compartments, and unstable footing led to accidents. Crew members needed to be constantly aware of their surroundings, not only for personal safety, but for the safety of those around them. Every action, swabbing the deck, checking barrel seals, or adjusting cargo, was both mundane and essential, illustrating how survival depended on the meticulous performance of ordinary tasks. Rituals and small routines also helped sailors endure. Lighting lanterns at set times, noting the condition of supplies, and maintaining personal items in a chaotic environment provided psychological stability. Superstitions such as avoiding certain knots, speaking carefully below deck, or keeping charms close offered comfort. These practices were not mere habit. They helped sailors maintain a sense of control in a world where illness, fatigue, and danger were constant companions. Despite the grimness, life below deck fostered a form of camaraderie unique to extended voyages. Shared hardship, mutual reliance, and collective observation created bonds that could endure even after returning to port. Sailors exchanged knowledge about remedies, rationing, and survival strategies, ensuring that lessons learned during one voyage benefited future expeditions. Social cohesion was a form of survival skill, as essential as tying knots or reading the stars. Ultimately, the world below deck was one of quiet struggle, endurance, and adaptation. Sailors survived not through heroics alone, but through attention to detail, disciplined routines, and a constant awareness of the fragile balance between life and disease, hygiene and infection, food and starvation. Every day required vigilance, observation, and cooperation, and each man depended on his crewmates as much as on his own skill. And as sailors looked forward to the distant horizon, anticipating storms, landfalls, and ports, they faced an unsettling thought. Could they truly survive extended voyages, where danger lurked not only in waves and storms above deck, but in the invisible threats of sickness, filth, and deprivation below? The cramped, dark, and damp environment below deck was a constant adversary, testing every sailor's resilience. Beyond the obvious discomforts, stench, poor ventilation, and narrow spaces, the real threats were slower, more insidious. Disease, fatigue, and malnutrition crept into the hold alongside the crew, often unnoticed, until their effects became serious. For medieval sailors, surviving these conditions demanded observation, improvisation, and an almost ritualistic adherence to mundane tasks that could mean the difference between life and death. One of the most persistent dangers was scurvy. Caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, this slow-moving illness could appear weeks or months into a voyage. Sailors suffered from bleeding gums, joint pain, lethargy, and slow-healing wounds. On long North Sea or Atlantic voyages, fresh fruit and vegetables were impossible to carry, and sailors relied solely on salted meat, dried grains, and beer or wine for hydration. Those who began to feel the first aches and weakness had little recourse beyond improvised remedies, such as consuming small amounts of fresh herbs if they could find them, or drinking the juice of limited port-borne citrus when available. Scurvy could weaken even the most seasoned sailor, making ordinary tasks, hauling rope, bailing water, or climbing masts, extraordinarily difficult. Dysentery and gastrointestinal illnesses were another constant concern. Spoiled food, contaminated water, or unwashed hands could quickly infect multiple crew members. Below deck, the combination of cramped quarters, poor sanitation, and humidity created the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Infections spread rapidly, leaving crew members weakened and unable to perform essential duties. Sailors improvised remedies as best they could. Herbal teas, vinegar washes, and minimal hygiene practices, all applied under conditions that limited their effectiveness. Even minor diarrhea or vomiting could escalate, weakening a sailor to the point where he could no longer assist in survival tasks, placing the entire crew at risk. Respiratory infections were equally insidious. Damp conditions, poor ventilation, and the close proximity of sailors created ideal conditions for pneumonia, bronchitis, or chronic colds. Symptoms often appeared gradually: a lingering cough, fatigue, or fever. Left unchecked, these illnesses could immobilize a sailor, forcing others to compensate for the lost labor. The hold was a confined environment where illness could rapidly multiply, and knowledge of early symptoms, cough patterns, skin color, or the sound of breathing became crucial. Experienced sailors learned to isolate sick crew members as best they could and maintain morale to prevent panic, which could exacerbate already dangerous conditions. Injury management below deck was equally critical. The labor of loading cargo, securing barrels, and maintaining the ship's structure in cramped conditions led to cuts, bruises, and sprains. Even a minor wound could become dangerous due to infection in the humid, unsanitary environment. Sailors improvised treatments using vinegar, herbs, or alcohol, applying compresses or bandages with limited resources. Amputation was a last resort in severe cases, performed under primitive conditions, and always accompanied by high risk. The stakes were high. One untreated injury could weaken the crew, leading to cascading failures in essential tasks during storms or emergencies. Food scarcity and monotony compounded the physical challenges. Hardtack, salted meat, and dried fish became the staple diet, and sailors often faced weeks without variety. Nutritional deficiency affected both strength and morale. Sailors developed strict rationing systems, sharing limited provisions carefully to prolong survival. Clever improvisation, such as soaking hardtack in water or combining small amounts of meat with legumes, became essential. The monotony of diet had a psychological impact as well. Eating the same bland, sometimes spoiled food daily tested patience, endurance, and mental stability. Sleep deprivation further intensified the struggle below deck. The rolling motion of the ship, the constant sounds of shifting cargo, and the proximity of fellow sailors made deep rest rare. Sailors adapted by taking short naps, creating makeshift pillows from bundles or clothing, and sleeping in shifts when possible. Sleep was not merely restorative, it was a survival tool. Fatigue could lead to accidents, mistakes in navigation, or the mishandling of cargo, all potentially fatal during storms or emergencies. Maintaining even minimal rest required ingenuity, discipline, and cooperation among crew members. Social dynamics were a silent factor in survival. Confined spaces amplified tensions. Disagreements over rationing, sleeping arrangements, or hygiene practices could escalate quickly. Leadership played a critical role in mediating conflicts, maintaining order, and enforcing rules. Senior sailors and captains often relied on authority, experience, and subtle psychological strategies to keep the crew functioning effectively. Cohesion was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a survival mechanism. A divided crew could fail in tasks as basic as securing the ship or bailing water. with consequences that could ripple across the entire voyage. Hygiene, though rudimentary, was carefully managed when possible. Sailors used small quantities of vinegar, seawater, or herbs to clean themselves. Ropes and sails were scrubbed to prevent mildew, and barrels were inspected for leaks or rot. Even minor attention to cleanliness could prevent the spread of disease, making repetitive, seemingly boring tasks critical for survival. These daily routines, repeated consistently, formed the backbone of life below deck, transforming monotony into a lifeline. The psychological burden of extended confinement was significant. Sailors faced a mixture of isolation, monotony, and constant threat from unseen dangers. Superstitions, small rituals, and shared storytelling became coping mechanisms. Counting knots, observing subtle changes in water, or discussing past voyages helped maintain focus. The crew's collective mental endurance became as important as physical stamina, and experienced sailors often guided younger crew members through these challenges, teaching techniques to preserve mental stability in extreme conditions. Resourcefulness and improvisation were constant companions. Damaged barrels were patched with tar, torn sails stitched with rope, and rationed food stretched as efficiently as possible. Sailors became adept at using what little they had, turning mundane repairs into essential survival strategies. The line between ordinary labor and life-saving action was often imperceptibly thin. A mismanaged rope or spoiled food could have consequences far beyond the immediate task. Every action mattered, and experience honed intuition, judgment, and coordination. As the voyage stretched on, sailors recognized patterns in the hold. Which barrels leaked first, which foods spoiled quickest, which tasks maintained morale, and which mistakes could lead to cascading failures. This experiential knowledge was invaluable, providing practical guidance for both survival and future voyages. It emphasized the core truth of maritime life. Mastery of the mundane was not trivial, it was essential. Every small, disciplined act contributed to the preservation of life under relentless, invisible pressures. Yet despite careful management and collective effort, danger lingered constantly. Illness, malnutrition, injury, and fatigue were unpredictable and relentless. A single misstep, a spoiled barrel, an untreated wound, or a lapse in attention could endanger multiple lives. Sailors learned to live with uncertainty, balancing vigilance, routine, and improvisation in a precarious equilibrium that stretched their endurance to the limit. And as they worked, slept, and survived in the dim, damp hold, a question remained in the minds of every sailor. How long could they endure these invisible threats before the hold itself became a tomb, a place where slow, quiet dangers claimed the unwary? The answer was never certain, and survival depended on constant observation, cooperation, and resilience, a precarious dance with forces that could never be fully controlled. As a medieval voyage drew on for weeks or even months, the hold of a ship became the true crucible of survival. Here, below deck, sailors confronted a combination of physical, environmental, and psychological challenges that were as formidable as any storm raging above. Damp, dark, and crowded, the hold was a place where disease, fatigue, and monotony converged, testing the endurance of every individual. Survival depended not on heroics, but on a disciplined, patient, and methodical approach to the seemingly mundane tasks of daily life. Crew members who endured long voyages learned to maintain routines with almost ritualistic precision. Tasks such as inspecting barrels for leaks, rationing food and water, cleaning ropes and sails, and checking for early signs of illness were repeated day after day. These actions, while unremarkable in themselves, were foundational to survival. Neglecting even a small detail, a rotting barrel, a slow leak, or an untreated wound could set off a chain reaction, weakening the crew and imperiling the voyage. The hold demanded vigilance, and the ordinary became extraordinary in its importance. Illness and malnutrition were constant threats, shaping not only physical health, but also the social dynamics of the crew. A sick sailor required care, and managing illness became a collective responsibility. Experience and observation determined which remedies were applied. Vinegar to clean wounds, herbs to soothe stomach ailments, and small amounts of fresh water or ale to maintain hydration. Even when treatments were crude or partially effective, they offered a chance of survival. Knowledge of these methods was passed from sailor to sailor, becoming an informal but critical system of healthcare on long voyages. Sleep and rest were equally vital, yet precarious. Below deck, sailors contended with the constant motion of the ship, confined spaces, and the sounds of cargo shifting in the hold. Sleep deprivation was inevitable, yet the ability to rest, even in short, fragmented periods, was crucial for maintaining strength and coordination. Sailors developed strategies to cope, sleeping in shifts, creating small personal spaces amid the chaos, and using clothing or bundles as improvised bedding. Sleep became both a physical necessity and a psychological anchor, allowing sailors to maintain focus and composure in an environment dominated by slow, insidious dangers. Food scarcity and diet monotony required constant ingenuity. Hardtack, dried fish, salted meat, and beans formed the bulk of daily rations. Sailors quickly learned to manage these limited resources carefully, rationing portions, rotating supplies, and improvising meals to extend freshness. Preservation techniques were essential. Barrels were inspected for spoilage, dried foods stored in the driest available spaces, and smaller portions shared to stretch meager supplies. These small, repetitive actions, performed with care and attention, became the backbone of sustenance. Survival depended as much on these quiet efforts as on the more visible labor of sailing the ship itself. Psychological endurance was equally critical. The hold could feel like a cage, a dark and damp enclosure, with the constant threat of illness, injury, or accidental death. Superstitions, rituals, and social interactions helped maintain morale. Sailors told stories, sang quietly, or observed small patterns in daily life to create a sense of stability and predictability. Leadership from captains or senior crew members provided guidance and mediated conflicts, preventing tensions from escalating into crises that could imperil the entire voyage. Social cohesion was a form of survival skill, as essential as physical labor or rationing. Resourcefulness and improvisation became second nature. Sailors patched sails with rope and tar, reinforced leaking barrels, and fashioned rudimentary tools from available materials. Even minor acts of ingenuity, tightening a rope just right, adjusting the position of a barrel to prevent shifting, or rearranging bedding to stay dry, could determine whether the crew survived a storm, illness, or long stretch of monotony below deck. Survival was rarely dramatic. It was the cumulative effect of countless, careful, deliberate actions. Experience below deck taught lessons that extended beyond individual voyages. Sailors who endured multiple expeditions carried knowledge of patterns in food spoilage, water rationing, disease prevention, and sleep management. They shared these insights with new crew members, creating an informal but vital repository of survival techniques. Over time, this practical knowledge enhanced both individual and collective resilience, allowing crews to undertake longer and more ambitious voyages with a higher chance of reaching port safely. Despite all precautions, danger remained persistent and unpredictable. A sudden outbreak of disease, an accident while handling cargo, or unexpected depletion of supplies could threaten survival. Sailors accepted that control was always partial. Preparation, discipline, and observation improved odds, but could never guarantee outcomes. Life below deck demanded humility and awareness. Every task mattered, every detail counted, and vigilance had to be maintained at all times. The human endurance displayed below deck reflects a profound adaptability. Sailors transformed the monotonous and unpleasant cleaning, monitoring supplies, observing symptoms, rationing food into acts that determined life or death. This endurance relied on collective effort, shared knowledge, and the meticulous repetition of seemingly mundane tasks. Ordinary labor became extraordinary in significance, highlighting the resilience and ingenuity of humans facing relentless, hidden dangers. By the end of a long voyage, the hold had taught sailors lessons that extended beyond survival. Discipline, observation, and cooperation were as vital as strength or skill. Life below deck was not glamorous, and it rarely featured in celebrated accounts of exploration or naval achievement. Yet it shaped the men who survived, the knowledge they passed down, and the maritime practices that would influence centuries of seafaring. The hold was a crucible of experience, endurance, and human ingenuity, a place where survival was earned through attention to the smallest, most repetitive tasks. And yet, even after surviving weeks or months in the oppressive confines of the hold, sailors faced a lingering question. How much of survival depended on skill, observation, and discipline, and how much on luck, timing, or forces beyond their control? Each voyage ended with the knowledge that no preparation could guarantee safety, that the quiet dangers of the hold were ever present, and that endurance itself was both fragile and remarkable. Imagine stepping onto the wooden piers of a medieval harbour. The air is thick with salt, smoke from nearby smithies, and the unmistakable smell of fish drying in the sun. Wooden ships creak and sway with the tide, their sails furled, ropes taut, and cargo awaiting unloading. Around you, the bustle of a working port unfolds. Merchants calling out prices, dockhands hauling barrels, sailors repairing sails, and customs officials inspecting goods. Medieval ports were the lifeblood of commerce, centers of exchange, and hubs of human activity, connecting coastal communities to distant lands. Yet beneath this apparent vitality lay complexity, danger, and an intricate web of routines that shaped both survival and trade. Medieval ports were far from uniform. Some, like Venice or Bruges, had expansive infrastructure, quays lined with warehouses, designated docks for specific cargoes, and systems of tolls and tariffs. Smaller ports, by contrast, were improvisational and chaotic, with temporary docks, ad hoc storage areas, and informal marketplaces. Regardless of size, ports had to manage the flow of ships, goods, and people efficiently, balancing trade opportunities with the constant threat of theft, decay, or mismanagement. Every cargo shipment, no matter how routine, carried both economic promise and potential peril. Daily life in a port was structured around these practical concerns. Dockhands coordinated the movement of goods, ensuring barrels, crates, and sacks were transferred from ship to shore without damage. Cargo often included perishables, salted fish, wine, grain, and sometimes live animals. Even when carefully packed, spoilage was common, and dock workers had to monitor temperature, moisture, and exposure to sunlight. Improper handling could ruin a shipment in hours, representing a significant financial loss for the merchants who depended on the sale. Every step required attention to detail, patience, and physical endurance. Merchants were acutely aware of risk. Markets were competitive. Prices fluctuated with supply and demand, and delays at port could cost fortunes. Goods arriving from distant regions, silk, spices, or rare metals, had already traveled hundreds of miles and were vulnerable to theft or damage in transit. Customs officials inspected cargoes for taxes and smuggling, adding another layer of complexity. Successful trade depended not only on acquiring goods, but on navigating regulations, maintaining records, and anticipating potential obstacles. Port life required both diligence and strategic thinking, even in seemingly mundane tasks like supervising, unloading, or cataloging inventory. Sailors, returning from long voyages, brought both relief and new challenges to the harbour. Ships needed repair after exposure to storms, salt water, and general wear. Sailors themselves were weary, ill, or malnourished, and their immediate needs, food, rest, and medical attention had to be balanced with cargo handling and commercial transactions. Experienced port managers understood the delicate coordination required. Delays in repairing a vessel could postpone departures, while neglecting the needs of crew or goods could undermine future business. The port was a place of constant problem-solving, where logistical skill and foresight were as important as physical labor. Harbors were also centers of social interaction and cultural exchange. Sailors, merchants, and travelers brought news, stories, and ideas from distant lands. Languages mingled on the docks, customs intertwined, and new technologies or techniques were often observed and adopted. This vibrant environment contributed to the diffusion of knowledge, shaping economic and cultural development. Yet it also created opportunities for tension. Rival traders competed aggressively, disputes arose over docking rights, and unfamiliar customs sometimes led to misunderstandings. Social skill, negotiation, and awareness of local norms were as critical to success as physical labor or navigational ability. The physical structure of a port played a key role in daily life and risk management. Quays and jetties were designed to facilitate unloading and protect ships from tides and storms. Warehouses stored goods under shelter, but ventilation, drainage, and protection from vermin were constant concerns. Ships were moored using ropes and anchors, carefully adjusted for tide changes. Failure to secure a vessel properly could result in drifting, damage, or sinking. Even the ordinary act of tying a rope or stacking a crate required skill and attention, illustrating how mundane tasks were intertwined with survival, commerce, and long-term prosperity. Port security was another continuous concern. Theft, piracy, and smuggling were persistent threats. Valuables such as spices, coin, or luxury textiles were often stored in guarded warehouses or under the supervision of port officials. Sailors and merchants relied on locks, chains, and watchmen to protect goods. Local authorities sometimes imposed curfews, patrols, or fines to maintain order, but enforcement was often inconsistent. Survival in the economic sense, protecting cargo and earning profit, required vigilance, planning, and an awareness of both human and environmental hazards. Ports were also centers of labor specialization. Skilled artisans worked on ship repair, sailmaking, carpentry, and rope production, providing essential services for seafaring operations. Laborers handled unloading, storage, and transportation. Knowledge was highly practical. Artisans had to understand the materials, the stresses of sea travel, and the rhythms of tides and tides' effects on docked vessels. This combination of skill and routine labor formed the backbone of the port economy, demonstrating how the ordinary details of craft, timing, and coordination were crucial for survival and prosperity. Health and hygiene in ports mirrored the challenges aboard ships. Crowded docks, warehouses, and inns fostered disease, transmission, and exposure to damp, stagnant water or spoiled food was common. Quarantine measures were sometimes employed during outbreaks, but understanding of infection was limited. Merchants and sailors learned to identify early symptoms, isolate the sick when possible, and implement practical measures to minimize risk. Even when rudimentary, these practices were essential for maintaining both human life and the commercial continuity of the port. Despite the apparent chaos, ports operated with remarkable coordination. Schedules for unloading ships, assigning labor, collecting taxes, and managing storage had to be maintained precisely. Delays or miscalculations could ripple through supply chains, causing spoilage, financial loss, or missed trading opportunities. Every worker, from the captain supervising unloading to the laborer hauling barrels, played a role in an intricate system that combined human skill, environmental awareness, and constant observation. Survival, both literal and economic, depended on the mastery of these ordinary, repetitive tasks. And yet, even in the busiest and best-managed ports, uncertainty persisted. Weather could delay arrivals or damage goods. Rival traders could undermine profits, and unforeseen circumstances, like sudden disease outbreaks among sailors, could disrupt operations. Daily life in a medieval harbor was not merely a matter of work. It was a constant negotiation with risk, environment, and human behavior. The port was a place where the mundane tying a rope, counting coins, stacking crates, was inseparable from survival. illustrating the profound interplay between ordinary labor and human endurance. As sailors, merchants, and laborers navigated these routines, a question lingered. Could anyone truly control the flow of goods, the movements of ships, or the health of the crew? Or was survival in the port itself a delicate balance of skill, observation, and luck that never guaranteed success? This question hung in the air like the scent of the sea, a reminder that even in bustling centers of commerce, human life and enterprise were always precarious. Beneath the surface bustle of a medieval port lay layers of hazards and labor that demanded constant attention. Ships, goods, and people converged in a confined space, creating a living network of interdependence, risk, and routine. Life in a port was not only about commerce, it was about survival, coordination, and the daily mitigation of both visible and invisible threats. Every action, from unloading barrels to monitoring tides, carried consequences that could ripple across the harbor and far beyond. One of the most immediate dangers in a port was the movement of ships themselves. Medieval vessels were cumbersome, their hulls heavy, and their docking dependent on precise timing and skill. A miscalculated approach could damage the ship, break masts, or crush cargo, potentially causing injuries to dockhands or sailors. Even after mooring, the tidal range posed constant challenges. Rising or falling, water levels could pull ships against docks, strain ropes, or leave vessels grounded. Dockmasters and sailors needed intimate knowledge of local tides, wind patterns, and currents to ensure the safety of ships, cargo, and crew. A single misjudgment could result in costly delays or irreversible damage. Cargo handling presented another layer of risk. Crates and barrels often contained perishable goods, fragile items, or valuables like spices, metals, and textiles. Improper stacking, rough handling, or misjudged weight distribution could crush goods or destabilize stacks, leading to accidents. Dockhands had to be meticulous, monitoring each crate's placement, adjusting for balance, and ensuring safe transport from ship to storage. Even a routine task, such as moving barrels of salted fish, could become critical, as spoilage or breakage might compromise the economic viability of a shipment. Every minor decision had amplified consequences in this environment. Disease was a constant, subtle threat in bustling ports. Sailors arriving from long voyages carried illnesses that could spread rapidly in crowded docks, warehouses, or inns. Respiratory infections, dysentery, and skin conditions were common, and quarantine measures were rudimentary at best. Public health knowledge was limited. Merchants and dock workers relied on observation, isolation when feasible, and rudimentary hygiene practices to prevent outbreaks. Simple measures, like draining stagnant water or keeping warehouses ventilated, were crucial for maintaining both human life and the continuity of trade. Even minor lapses in hygiene could trigger cascading problems, highlighting the precarious balance between routine labor and survival. Harbor life also depended heavily on time management and coordination. Ships arrived unpredictably, tides changed daily, and labor was finite. Coordinating, unloading, repairing vessels, managing storage, and preparing for departures required careful scheduling. Delays could result in spoiled goods, missed contracts, or financial loss. Dockmasters and port officials relied on detailed records, observational skills, and experience to anticipate bottlenecks. The port functioned as a living organism. Each worker's actions affected the flow of goods, the safety of ships, and the welfare of sailors. The ordinary details of timing, organization, and attention to routine became matters of both economic and physical survival. Weather was another unpredictable factor shaping port life. Storms could damage vessels docked in seemingly calm harbors, break ropes, flood warehouses, or sweep goods into the sea. Sailors and dock workers learned to observe subtle signs, changes in cloud patterns, wind shifts, or barometric readings when available. Emergency protocols doubling mooring lines, reinforcing cargo, or temporarily relocating goods were routine preparations. The unpredictability of weather demanded both vigilance and flexibility, turning mundane tasks like checking ropes or securing crates into essential life-saving practices. Crime, theft, and smuggling were ever-present concerns. Ports attracted opportunists who targeted valuable cargo or distracted crews during unloading. Merchants and dockmasters developed strategies to mitigate these risks. Guards, chains, locked warehouses,